you want to read it.
Huh?
You want to read it first?
Read my own introduction?
No.
Should I refer to myself in the third person? I'll let you handle it.
Okay, I'll tell you when. All right, we're good.
Welcome to our second discussion in our series on Catholicism and Socialism and Communism. We welcome back Dr. Frank Grabowski, a professor of philosophy at Rogers State University in Claremore, Oklahoma. Dr. Grabowski is a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit. He is the author of the book Plato, Metaphysics, and the Forms, as well as writing numerous papers and winning the RSU United Way Chili competition.
Did do that.
This is Dr. Grabowski's fifth visit to the Newman Center, and we are pleased to have him back. Over to you, Dr. Grabowski.
Well, thank you, George. I appreciate that. Well, I just want to first of all take a moment to invite everyone here to, when they have a moment, to obviously pray for Gerald and his family. He's, I guess, waiting COVID test results, but we should also obviously bear in mind others who are either suffering, have suffered, or will suffer from the virus. Again, we will get through this. It is not the end of the world, but it can be very painful and damaging. So, obviously, being prayerful of those people who are dealing with this would be a good idea. So, I appreciate you coming back. Those of you who have returned, if this is your first visit, last week we just kind of basically went through the fundamentals of capitalism and socialism, and then we talked a little bit about some of the vital beliefs of Catholics, focusing mainly on the nature of man. And we'll see today that those beliefs about the nature of man will play an important role in what the church has to say about those two particular systems of economics. I'm just going to take a moment here and just ask if anybody has any comments they'd like to make about. It's my understanding that Gerald had some conversations with some who had attended last week's discussion, and just wondering if anybody has anything they want to ask or add, or before we get started with today's discussion. No, okay. Well, it's always a challenge to know where to begin, and so I thought it might be useful to take a look at a couple of attempts. And again, I don't want to mislead you into thinking that any of these individuals that I'm about to introduce you to have made this sort of definitive defense of socialism. But as I indicate here, the church has had a complicated relationship with socialism. Certainly, I mean, if you've been paying attention, Pope Francis has been accused from time to time of being a socialist. I don't know if you've heard this before, but this is some of the attacks that are made against the Holy Father. I personally don't think those attacks are warranted, but I also think that Francis can at times be inartful with his speech, and so again, we have to always ask questions when we're unclear. But I do not think that Pope Francis would ever say that he is a socialist, that we should adopt socialism or communism or anything of the sort. But there have been individuals and there have been movements that sort of rub shoulders, one might say, with socialist thinking. And I just wanted to introduce you to a couple. The first person, and you may or may not be familiar with this individual, her name was Doris Day. And I give you her date. She lived from 1897 to 1980. So I indicate here that Day was a journalist and a social activist who co-founded the Catholic Worker Movement, and also co-founded its newspaper, The Catholic Worker. Although she didn't consider herself a socialist, Day did claim that socialists and indeed communists are drawn to their ideologies owing to their goodness, not the goodness of the systems, but the goodness of the individuals. they're good-hearted, they're benevolent, they care, right? They're empathetic. And that the evils of the systems are not intrinsic to the systems themselves, but rather arise from the avarice of the persons advocating for them. So what we're going to do is kind of go through this, and I've included a lot of quotations here. And so, I'll pause from time to time, emphasize certain words, and invite you to make comments of your own. But the quotation here from Day that I decided to include is that regarding the Cuban communist revolution, and you may or may not be familiar with, I'm not sure how in touch with world history you are, but there was a communist revolution in Cuba. Cuba is still communist, I think. I don't think anybody really believes that they have changed their ways. But regarding this particular revolution, she wrote, quote, "We are on the side of the revolution. We believe there must be new concepts of property, which is proper to humanity, and that the new concept is not so new. There is a Christian communism and a Christian capitalism." Okay, so and I think she's trying to emphasize that, the evils of communism are not intrinsic to the system, that one can be a Christian communist, one can be a Christian capitalist. That may be difficult to stomach, but again, she was at least confident that the two are not incompatible. The other group that I just wanted to mention, and you may or may not be familiar with the term liberation theology, but liberation theology is very popular in many South American borders. Brazil, for one, I'll mention that in a moment, but Argentina and other regions of South America which suffer from serious poverty. And of course, that's very widespread in South America. So liberation theology is a social and political movement within the church that interprets the gospel in light of the lived experiences of the oppressed. It often draws heavily upon socialist and communist ideologies and has a strong following in South America, particularly the Brazilian Catholic Church. Liberation theology teaches the need to return to a politically and culturally decentralized church, which I mentioned here, many of its followers believe to be how the church used to be in its beginnings. This is, kind of get right back to basics. Right now we've got all of these hierarchies and structures and the political machinations, and then that distracts us from really what the church is about, which is meeting the needs of people. And liberation theologians focus on the material needs of persons. So among its core aims is to draw attention to social and economic injustices and the role of the church in addressing these injustices. So I decided here to include a quotation from Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who's a Dominican, and author of the book A Liberation Theology, which is, based on my readings and my studies, widely considered to be sort of foundational text in liberation theology. And I've included here a passage from another work of his, The Power of the Poor in History, where he writes, "The poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral, and it is not ethically innocent. The poor are a byproduct of the system, in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are the oppressed, exploited proletariat." So that's a word commonly used in communist quarters. They love to speak of Marx loved to talk about the inevitable conflict or war between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So they are the oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor and despoiled of their humanity. And that has very sort of a Marxist flavor to it. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order. So it's very revolutionary. It's thinking in terms of society being the problem, and the system that is currently in place isn't working. It's bringing about greater disparity of wealth, right? It's creating an impoverished class, an oppressed class, and so the one of the principal aims of the church, should be to try to construct a better society or a better world order that would better meet the material needs of the persons. So both Day and these liberation theologians, I don't think it's fair to necessarily call them flat-out socialists or flat-out communists, but certainly there are these ideas that are present in their thinking. And they see the church as, to say that it's a tool or an instrument may not be entirely fair today in liberation theologians, but they see certainly one of the central purposes of the church to have this kind of social impact, whereby recreating society, restructuring society, we can bring about certain economic ends and correct economic injustices, perhaps even social injustices. So can we just take a moment here, pause, and see if anybody has any reactions or responses to any of this? Yeah, what's your name?
I'm Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
What's the difference between communism and socialism?
Well, Mary sort of asked this question in a roundabout way. Look, the simple response would be, I think, and I think I'm right in saying this, though I'm certainly not an expert, that communism is a brand of socialism. Okay, but not all socialists are communists. So communism is a very well-defined ideology, and I think that the principal proponent, right, the principal author of communism would be somebody like Karl Marx. There were socialists before Karl Marx, and there were socialists after Karl Marx. And so communism, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the documents of the church that speak directly to socialism and communism as ideologies. But I think that one of the defining characteristics of communism that isn't necessarily a defining characteristic of socialism is that communism is necessarily atheistic. In other words, the way that, there are certain metaphysical components of communism that define it that don't necessarily define all socialist societies. So, whenever you read Karl Marx, for instance, he was famous for having said that religion is the opium of the people. So he comes to the table with certain assumptions that God doesn't exist, and religion is just really there to try to keep people in check and to keep them. And so he actually thought that religion was, I think, it's safe to say that he believed that it was a bad thing, that it was established in order to keep the proletariat, the working class, inebriated, in this sort of state of this constant state of opiatic high, where they don't necessarily see the poor plight that they're living in, and so religion was there as a way of trying to restrain them, and that the only way, of course, to liberate oneself from one's chains. The slavery that the indentured servitude that they're living in would be to come to see that, well, religion is a farce, that God doesn't exist. So that's just a vague, there's obviously, to distinguish the two would take a lot more time, but that may get you started. So when someone like Dorothy Day or the liberation theologians, when they talk about economic injustice, the suffering of the proletariat, I don't necessarily think that they would want to align themselves with communists, because, of course, with communists, there's this connotation, well, you have to be an atheist. Whereas socialism sort of allows the possibility that you believe in God, but that you still care for the working class, and that you're still mindful of economic and social justice. So is that pretty good? Is there anything else? Okay, so here's what we really need to ask ourselves, right? And we could take this in either order. We could start with capitalism, and then move on to socialism, or we could start with socialism and move on to capitalism. And I decided, well, let's start with socialism. And the reason I decided that we ought to start with socialism is that the church, I think, has been unequivocal in its condemnation of socialism. And there are a couple of just initial passages here that I'd like to read to you. One is from the Catechism, This is from section 2425, where it's written, the church has rejected the totalitarian and atheistic ideologies associated in modern times with communism and socialism. I mean, that's pretty black and white. And then there's an encyclical, Quadragesimo Anno, and we'll see this is a very important encyclical. This published by Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno. It's Latin for in the 40th year, which means it was published 40 years to the day after Rerum Novarum, which is another important document that we'll be looking at, which was published by Leo XIII, who is, I mean, it was an amazing poem. I mean, in fact, a couple of books that, I mean, if you're interested in this stuff, and you're a nerd like me and you like to read these things, one book, and both of these are published by CAN, and so if you're familiar, CAN is a Catholic publication, and they do great stuff. And so one is just, it's a book entitled The Popes Against Modern Errors, and so this is a collection of encyclicals from a variety of popes. And then I've got, this is one of my favorites here, it's just Leo XIII's encyclicals, including Aeterni Patris, which is the encyclical that he wrote in order to rekindle a passion for scholastic philosophy and Thomas Aquinas. And that was written, I think, in the latter part of the 19th century. But this is A Light in the Heavens, the great encyclical letters of Pope Leo XIII. And I mean, my gosh, this guy wrote a lot of encyclicals. I don't know if they have them numbered here, but there are many. And they're all like really, really good. I mean, written at an incredibly high intellectual level. And then what I also appreciate about his encyclicals is that they're concise. They're not, I just printed Pope Francis's recent encyclical, and it's 100 pages. It's like a book. And so I'll get around to it eventually. But Laudato Si was also just a massive work. And again, sometimes it's hard to digest what he writes just because it is so broad and so vast. And I can sometimes appreciate the brevity, right? Brevity is wit. Brevity of Leo's encyclicals. But anyhow, what is Leo? Pius. So this was written 40 years after Rerum Novarum, which we'll talk about in a moment. But Pius writes, socialism, like all errors, contains some truth, which moreover the Supreme Pontiffs have never denied. It is based, nevertheless, on a theory of human society peculiar to itself and irreconcilable with true Christianity. Religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. So, I guess take that, Dorothy Day. I mean, Dorothy Day is like, well, there could be a Christian communism and a Christian capitalism, and it seems as though Pius is refuting this. He says, again, religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. They are incompatible. They do not go together. And so he says, no one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist. Which again, he's not denying that within socialism, within socialist ideologies, there are worthwhile ideas, but he is denying that true socialism and true Catholicism are compatible. Okay, so I introduce you to these passages because that will establish the conclusion. That's the conclusion. That, in other words, the Church has not cast a favorable light on socialism as an ideology. And so the question then becomes, well, how do they arrive at that conclusion? I mean, what are the arguments that they've given? And I mentioned this to you a week ago. At least I think I did. But if I didn't, or if I wasn't clear, the point I really want to try to get across to you, and it's something that it's a lesson that we learn from Aristotle, we learn from Plato, we learn from all the great thinkers from the ancient and medieval periods, and I guess to some extent the modern period. But if we're going to settle moral or political disputes, if we have questions about how to arrange society, how to set it up, or how to arrange our own lives, our sort of internal selves, then the answers to these questions will ultimately have to be traced back to human nature. And that's a metaphysical question. What is man? Who is man? Where does man come from? And what is man's telos? And I mentioned this a week ago. Telos, a fancy Greek word that means end or purpose. Aristotle was using this word. But it's also a concept that is widely used by Thomas Aquinas. Right? So the idea is that humans are built a certain way. And so being built a certain way, we have to play by the rules. And who writes the rules? Well, Christians, Catholics, but God writes the rules. And so there is a natural law that permeates the world that will ultimately govern our lives. And either by obeying the natural law or by not obeying the natural law, this will determine whether or not we're living well or living poorly, whether our lives are properly ordered or disordered. So this is the framework that I think we need to think about this question. What makes socialism so bad, or what could potentially make capitalism bad? The question has to begin with, well, what is the nature of man? What does our faith teach us about who we are? And so again, this we could talk for hours and days and months about this. But I decided, well, what are we going to? Let's focus on a couple of things. Well, what are a couple of socialism's great errors or great failures? And I think that the two that I really want to talk about is firstly private property. I mean, the church has made certain pronouncements about private property, and I want to talk about that, and then more generally just human nature. And the passages that I selected, and that for that section, have to do with work and the role that work plays in our lives. And ultimately, it's not a bad thing. Work is a good thing, right? I mean, well, for one thing, it keeps us out of trouble, but I mean, it's also it gives our lives dignity. And as John Paul will say, it makes us more of a human being. Work does. So we'll get to that in a moment. But let's start with the church's views on private property and how they come into conflict with socialism. So we've talked already about how socialism is the view, again, that there is no such thing as private property, or at least it works to try to eliminate it. The goal is to try to set up society in a way where property is commonly owned. And what does that mean exactly? Does that mean like this chair belongs to everybody, and if somebody wants it, all they have to do is ask for it, and I have to give a receipt to them? These are complicated matters. But the way that I think it's most easily understood is simply in terms of how we exchange goods and services, and the fact that we work for a company, or maybe people work for us, and within a capitalist system, the goal is to try to, well, among other things, maximize profits. But within a socialist system, well, that is never a goal, because, of course, there are no profits to be made if either the government owns the means of production or communities as a whole own the means of production. So within a communist or within a socialist state, there can be no such thing as private property. Now, the question becomes, well, what are we to make of this? And so these are some lengthy passages. Like I said, we'll kind of split them up into chunks, and I'll draw your attention to certain words or phrases that I think are important. But we'll begin with a passage from Leo XIII. I mentioned him, Rerum Novarum. This is a really, really important encyclical for anybody who's trying to wrap their heads around the church's position on the economy and how we ought to conduct ourselves economically within a society. So, what does he say in this particular encyclical? Well, here's a passage. He writes, "It is surely undeniable when a man engages in remunerative labor," and that's where you're working for someone and you're earning a wage. That's what remuneration means. It means that you're giving labor, right? You're doing something, and then somebody is paying you somehow for your services. He says that when a man engages in this kind of labor, the impelling reason and motive for his work is to obtain property, and therefore to hold as his very own, right? To hold this property as his very own. If one man hires out to another his strength or skill, he does so for the purpose of receiving in return what is necessary for the satisfaction of his needs. He has to eat. He has to clothe himself. He has to provide for himself, perhaps his family, shelter. He therefore expressly intends to acquire and this is the important word here, a right. Full and real. And so Leo here is telling us that man has a right to property. Now, if you know anything about political philosophy, you've studied political science, right? Have you ever read John Locke? Okay, so John Locke is one of the great Enlightenment thinkers. And he wrote a first treatise on government and a second treatise on government. And in the second treatise on government, he articulates three fundamental or natural rights that man possesses. And they may sound familiar to you. He says that man by nature has a right to life, liberty, and property. Now, of course, that's changed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Property becomes what? Pursuit of happiness, right? Yeah. But I mean, where is he borrowing this from? I mean, it's clear he's borrowing this from John Locke. So the Enlightenment thinkers, particularly John Locke, embraced this idea of man having a natural right to property, and Leo here seems to be consenting, or at least agreeing to this idea. He says to acquire a right for nation. Man has a right not only to receive wages or property, but man has a right to do what? To dispose of that wages and property how he sees fit. Now, of course, Leo would no doubt want to put a caveat here and say, well, you can't. Now, it's not always right how he puts those wages to use or what he earns. So, but man certainly has a right to make use of what he earns. Just to continue, thus, if he lives sparingly, saves money, and for greater security invests his savings in land, the land in such a case is only his wages under another form, and consequently a working man's little estate thus purchased should be as completely at his full disposal as are the wages he receives for his labor. But it is precisely in such power of disposal that ownership obtains, whether property consists of land or chattel. Socialists, therefore, by endeavoring to transfer the possessions of individuals to the community at large, strike at the very interests of every wage earner. They violate the fundamental natural right that man possesses, the, one might say, God-given right that man possesses, since they, he continues, would deprive him of the liberty of disposing of his wages and thereby of all hope and possibility of increasing his resources and of bettering his condition in life. Okay, long passage. Thank you for bearing with me and with Leo. But again, I think this is an important passage to bear in mind, right? Man, by nature, it possesses the right to, as he puts it, the right, full and real, to receive based on his labor, wages, property, and then he also has the right to dispose of what he obtains through his labor how he wishes. Okay, any response to that? So I've written little notes to myself here in the margins. I say here, man has the right to dispose of his wages and property however he pleases. Of course, that may be oriented to the good, may not be oriented to the good. But regardless, man possesses this right, and so should be held accountable. And I think that's something that when you think about redistribution of property and sort of how the state, more or less, how it requires that the property be redistributed, what I think one might argue is that does away with the responsibility or the accountability that we hold people to in how they would otherwise dispose of their wages. And so then the burden falls upon the state. And so people then become neither good nor bad in how they spend their money because, well, they don't necessarily spend their money. The money is taken from them. And they are then, in return, provided with certain state-sponsored goods, whether it's food or health care. So let's continue with Leo. This is a different encyclical, Quod Apostolici Muneris. Here's what he writes there. Lured in fine by the greed of present goods, which is the root of all evils, which some coveting have erred from the faith, they, and here he's talking about socialists, have assailed the right of property sanctioned by natural law. Right? So this is within at least Catholic moral theology. There's this notion of natural law. It can actually dates back to the ancient Stoics spoke extensively about the natural law, but we see also Thomas Aquinas make abundant use of this notion, natural law, not the law of gravity, but the moral law. And so he says again, the socialists, assail the right of property sanctioned by the natural law and by a scheme of horrible wickedness, while they seem desirous of caring for the needs and satisfying the desires of all men. They strive to seize and hold in common whatever has been acquired either by title of lawful inheritance, and this is actually something that will come up multiple times, the idea that if you're married or if your parents die, that you have the right to their goods, you have the right to their wealth, that the state can't just swoop in and take that right away from you, for what is rightfully yours away from you, and have a right to hold it without anyone being justified by by labor of brain and hands, or by thrift in one's mode of life. So I think one of the constant themes that we'll see here is that right, when we talk about man being made in the image of God, and that's something that last week I said, okay, one of the fundamental features of man's nature is that he's made in the image of God. And I said, well, what does that mean exactly? I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but we talked about a number of features that both man and God share. But one of the I think the things that will really come across in this, firstly, is that man is endowed with free will. Man is endowed with free will. That we can make certain choices, and those choices we need to be held accountable for. Because otherwise, we would never be able to assess whether a person is good or bad. And we'll also see that without choice, we would never be in a position to cultivate virtue, which we know as Catholics play a critical role in our pursuit of the good. Were there never any dangers, were the state always there to help us out, there'd never be a need for generosity. There'd never be a need for courage. There'd never be a need for temperance, if mommy and daddy were always there to sort of clean up our mess. So we have to clean up our own messes. We have to straighten up our own bedrooms. And it's based on the work that we put into our lives in the labor when we're at work, or when we build relationships, when we try to maintain family structures. These things will ultimately play a role in cultivating certain characters, and that will hopefully prepare us for the life to come. So, free will and labor, just as God labored. We'll see. Just as God labored in creating the world, he puts Adam to work as a co-participant in the creative process. So it's not like, again, like I said, God doesn't just create the world like an aquarium, right, where he then drops his little pet fishes in and just sort of watches them swimming back and forth. That's the wrong way of looking at the relationship between God and man. Man, while we're not an equal, we have to take on certain responsibilities. We have to continue the process that God started. So let's continue. A couple more passages here. This one again is from back to Leo, Rerum Novarum. In section 9, he says, truly, that which is required for the preservation of life and for life's well-being is produced in great abundance from the soil, but not until man has brought it in. This is, to me, really important. I was thinking about this as I was just reading, and when we go to a fast food restaurant, right? And we order a hamburger or a taco or something like that. It's really easy. I mean, even when we go to the grocery store and we buy a box of cereal, it's easy for us to sort of take for granted how those things got there, right? Like you go up to the cashier and you say, I'll take a Big Mac, and a fry, and a large drink, and a few minutes later, boom, you've got it right there in a greasy paper bag. And then here you are just munching away, not really thinking about how that food got to be there. And what I have in mind here is the mechanism, right? So what if I said to you, okay, let's have a contest, right? We're both going to eat hamburgers today. What's going to happen though is I'm going to go to the fast food market. I'm going to go to McDonald's, right? What I want you to do is I want you to make a hamburger from scratch. And you go, well, what do you mean exactly? Like go to the grocery store and buy some ground beef? I'm like, no. I mean, like from scratch. Like the ground beef came from somewhere, right? And so you've got to raise a cow, and then you have to slaughter the cow, and then you have to process the cow meat. And you want fries with that, right? Okay, then you also have to cultivate potatoes and soft drinks. I mean, those again just don't come from heavenly fountains, right? They'll fall like manna from the sky. I mean, you actually have to. So, I mean, think in terms of time, think in terms of expense, the amount of money it would take. And then I think the other thing you might want to take into consideration is how good is that thing going to taste at the end of the day? Probably, you might say it's going to be really good because it's wholesome. Like but I mean, how many of us really know how to slaughter a cow? And then you've got to cook it, right? And so I mean, either you're going to build a Weber grill from scratch, or you're going to have to dig a hole and somehow start a fire. I mean, it becomes mind-boggling the amount of the coordination involved in the production of something as simple as a hamburger. I mean, the bun too. Let's not forget about that. I mean, you've got to harvest the wheat and process it into some kind of flour, and my gosh, and 5 years later, you might actually have a hamburger. I mean, maybe. And so, why do I bring this up? Well, because I think that this is, kind of, sort of what Leo is getting at. Again, he says, not until man has brought it into cultivation and expended upon it his solicitude and skill. There's a need for us to work the land. We can't just simply sit around and expect things to be given to us. Right? There's a need for labor. And again, this idea of labor is going to come, we're going to see this later in some of these other texts. But let me just continue. He says, now when man thus turns the activity of his mind and the strength of his body toward procuring the fruits of nature, by such act, he makes his own that portion of nature's field which he cultivates. So what is this? Well, this is a right to property. Now you have your parcel of land. I'm thinking of it in real basic terms. You have your parcel of land. And here are your seeds, right? And here's your fence, and get to work, right? I mean, bring about, and then of course, if you are talented enough at raising cattle, you can sell the cattle for profit. And then you can take your profit to improve your farm, or you can build an extension to the house, or you might decide to sell the farm altogether and go into some other industry. Of course, this all requires the free exchange of goods, the free exchange of property, which is anathema, of course, to socialist thinking. Right, just to sort of finish this passage, that portion on which he leaves, as it were, the impress of his personality, so that when we work the land, there's an attachment to it, that in a sense we become one with it. I mean, not exactly, but it becomes ours. It's my land, and I can do with it what I wish, and hopefully I decide to do something useful with it that can certainly benefit me, benefit my family, perhaps benefit society as a whole. So he says he cannot but be just that. He should possess that portion as his very own, and have a right to hold it without anyone being justified in violating that right. So we have a right to owning or having this, but we also have responsibility to make wise use of it, to bring about the fruit, right? To not just simply have it and kick back our heels and let the grass grow, but we have to mow it. We have to plant the seeds, and we have to harvest the crops. That this is part of the the human condition. This is part of what we were made to do. Again, Adam is told to till and keep the earth. It was a direct instruction, and so of course we'll have fights over who the apple tree belongs to, and who has a right to this land or that. Well, we leave that up to maybe legal authorities to sort out. But again, there's this cliche. I forget who said it, but property is theft. You often hear this spoken of in communist and socialist circles. But of course, you can't steal what isn't yours, and so if you eradicate private property, there's no such thing as that. Let me just take you through this last passage here, and then we'll kind of move on. It says that right to property, therefore, which has been proved to belong naturally, again, we have a natural right, to individual persons, must likewise belong to man in his capacity of head of a family. And you can't understand any of this without understanding the need, the purpose that the family plays, the role the family plays. Nay, that right is all the stronger in proportion as the human person receives a wider extension in the family group. It is a most sacred law of nature that a father should provide food and all necessaries for those whom he has begotten. Just as the good Lord provides for us the materials, we are then to take those materials, rearrange those materials, change those materials, modify them, and manipulate them in ways so as to bring about additional goods. It's the puzzle. We've got to piece it together. We just don't simply get it ready-made. It says, and continue his personality should be by him provided with all that is needful to enable them to keep themselves decently from want and misery amid the uncertainties of this mortal life. As we'll see, work is hard. It's not fun, and one of the penalties that is placed upon Adam because of his disregarding God's command is that his his labor will be at times unfruitful. That it will give rise, as he says, thistle and thorn or something like that. So, but that doesn't mean that we should stop working altogether. Just because we don't always achieve what we've set out to achieve doesn't mean that we should stop. So let me just take a moment here, because I'm going to get through some of these others. Any comments or questions so far? So, in short, socialism, according to the church, violates man's natural right to own his own stuff, to private property, and furthermore to work for it, to earn it, right? I mean, this is fundamental, and this is often what separates many Catholics from other Christians, is that those of us who make it, those of us who join God in his heavenly kingdom, have earned it. At least in part. I mean, we can never earn salvation, but we still have to work our butts off. I mean, it doesn't come easy. All right, so what else? Well, let's. I'm not going to be able to go through all of this, so I'll pick some of the juicier passages. So let's take a look at the first there on page 3. This is the Church Against Socialism on Human Nature. Yeah, this is a good one. So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a famous book entitled On Social Contract. And the very first sentence of that book is, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. What he means by that, simply put, is that man is sort of born naturally good. He's free. The noble savage. Think of the noble savage. He's just out there frolicking in the fields by himself, taking what he wants, and everybody's taking whatever they want because there is no property, and it's just the world is our oyster. The world is everyone's. But then society, right, comes in, and they begin to sort of separate people. You go here, you go there, you do this, you do that, and then that places man in chains. Right? So that's when all this corruption comes about. The question then becomes, well, what would the church say to this? this? Well, let's turn to Leo the 13th again. He's becoming our favorite pope. Here's what he says. I love this. And this is maybe maybe a bitter pill to swallow. Maybe yes, maybe no. But he says, it must be first of all recognized that the condition of things inherent in human affairs must be borne with. For it is impossible to reduce civil society to one dead level. In other words, the goal may be to flatten society. Because this is what we talk about nowadays. We're like, we see people who are hungry, or we see people who are homeless, or we see people who are ill and who are unable to receive health care. And we say, gosh, things are sure unfair, and gosh, it's unequal, right? And so we're like, well, but then you've got the people up here who have everything. So you've got the haves and you have the have-nots, and the goal would be, well, maybe we can kind of like bring them together, and so you've sort of flattened the top. And the question then becomes, well, then will you end up having a just society? And what Leo is saying here is, well, it's impossible to reduce society to a single level. It's impossible to flatten it out that way. He says socialists may, in that intent, do their utmost, but all striving against nature is in vain. It's like, you're in your living room or you're in your dorm room, and you see a little like a bubble up in your carpet, and you're like, well, I don't want that bubble there, and so you step on it, right? And what ends up happening is, of course, the bubble disappears here, but it ends up popping up someplace else, right? And you step on that bubble, and then, well, someplace else, boom, it pops up. And so the attempt to try to equalize will of course never come to fruition. Like that's an impossibility. That, of course, doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight for justice and that we shouldn't address the needs of the have-nots. But what I've written here in the margin is, there is a structure to society that cannot be eliminated without destroying society itself. You know who else says this? Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas, he says this not all about society, but he says this about the cosmos. That when God created the universe, we think of it often in terms of like, well, put the planets here, and here's where he put Earth, and then, he planted the trees, and he populated it with, sometimes we think of it that way. But the way that Thomas likes to depict it is that there is use a fancy word, an ontological hierarchy. Okay? Ontology is a fancy word that philosophers use to talk about the structure of reality, okay? Being, right? The nature of being. And so one way of seeing reality isn't just the way that it's spread out in space, but to think of it metaphysically or ontologically, where you have a hierarchy of beings, where at the top you have the angels, and as you begin to descend, you work through human beings, four-legged animals, fishes, birds, and then eventually you reach plants and other sort of lower life forms. But Thomas's point is that, look, there's no way of eliminating the differences within reality, the ontological differences in reality, without destroying reality. This is a fundamental feature of the world, that there are these distinctions. And so the same can be said about society. There is a division of labor. You go to McDonald's to buy that hamburger. Does everybody do the same job? No, they don't all do the same job. Could they all do the same job? Well, you'd never get a hamburger, right? I mean, if everybody was doing the same thing, not only would that ruin the efficiency of the hamburger making system or factory, but you would never get you would never get the hamburger out of it. I mean, whether it's the Newman Center, whether it's the university, whether it's a family, there has to be a structure. There has to be a hierarchy. The buck has to stop somewhere, right? When there's a decision-making process. Somebody has to be the designated leader, if you will. Because otherwise, you'll just argue what to have for dinner. One person wants chicken, one person wants beef, the kid wants cotton candy. Does the kid have an equal vote? No, of course not. Ultimately, mom and or dad have to put the foot down. And so the same goes for society, that to reduce society to a dead level, he thinks is impossible. Let me just, a couple more here. skip down to the third passage here. This is also from Rerum Novarum. Here Leo says, the other pains and hardships of life will have no end or cessation on earth. For the consequences of sin are bitter and hard to bear, and they must accompany man so long as life lasts. This is the fall, right? Man is fallen. And as a result, man has to work. Now, of course, man worked prior to the fall, but work now, it sucks. It's really bad. It's hard. You go to work, you don't get paid enough. You try to do things, and sometimes they work out well, and sometimes they don't work out well. But look, this is just a fundamental feature of life. So he says, just to skip down to the bottom of that passage, nothing is more useful than to look upon the world as it really is. And that is, look, you've got to face the facts. You have to acknowledge how the world is structured. Look, there's a hierarchy in nature. There are predators, there are prey. The minute that you defang the predator, then they die out, right? And then, of course, the prey become overpopulated, and the whole order of nature becomes imbalanced. I mean, there has to be a balance, right? And the balance will often involve inequities, inequalities. And so I thought it'd be interesting here also to take a look at what John Paul says. And this is from Laborem Exercens, which in Latin means through work. And so there he writes, just briefly, in spite of all this toil, perhaps in a sense because of it, work is a good thing for man, even though it bears the mark of a bonum arduum, a good difficulty. It's good to work hard. I always tell my students, if it's easy, it's probably not worth doing, right? It's like setting a video game to the easy level. You play Civilization on Prince or something like that. It's like you win. It's really easy. You might say, hey, yeah, I got an achievement, but you really didn't achieve it. You've got to jack it up to King or Emperor or deity if you really, right? If you really want to win the game. Because when you play at an easy level, it isn't so much you winning as the computer losing. He says, this does not take away from the fact as such that it is a good thing for man. I like the last sentence too. He says, work is a good thing for man, because through work, man not only transforms nature, right, through his labor, adapting it to his own needs, but he also achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more of a human being, because we are beings at work. This is a point that Aristotle makes. We are beings at work. We are not fully formed. We have to cultivate virtue. We are not just given it, handed it to us on a silver platter. We have to earn it. We have to work for it. So, in the time that we have in 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to go through some of these other passages here where the church has made pronouncements about capitalism. But any comments about any of the passages that we've gone through so far? Does this all seem to you obvious, or is anything to you shocking or surprising?
Pretty much for me, it was not necessarily obvious, but I definitely just understand exactly what is being said, and I agree with it because I have for.
Well, So here's what's good, right? We know the truths, but we don't always know the why behind the truths. Mm-hmm. And so I think whether we're having a debate over this, or frankly anything that we debate about, whether it's abortion, capital punishment, it always comes back to who is man? What is man? What is our purpose? What is our nature? What were we designed to do? And that can really help to inform us. I mean, what it provides us with then is the lead up to the conclusion. This is the evidence or the premises that will ultimately lead to the conclusion. So let's just, again, quickly, because I know that many of you probably need to get going. But, what I say at the bottom of page 3 is the church has been consistent in its condemnation of socialism, but that doesn't mean that capitalism has been has gotten off the hook. It's not that it's not without its faults, because of course capitalism is. It is problematic from time to time, depending on how it's put to use. So I like this Quadragesimo Anno. This is back to Pius. And what Pius says is, right, with all his energy, Leo the 13th sought to adjust this economic system according to the norms of right order. Hence, it is evident that capitalism is not to be condemned in itself, and surely it is not of its own nature vicious, but it does violate right order when capital hires workers, that is, the non-owning working class, with a view to and under such terms that it directs business and even the whole economic system according to its own will, right, and advantage, scorning the human dignity of the workers and the social character of economic activity and social justice itself and the common good. So what we'll see in these passages, and again I'll jump around, is that capitalism is a tool. It's a tool. It can be put to good use. It can be put to vile, evil use. So that's just the nature of the beast. Let's continue here. John Paul, I like this passage. He asks, well, now that communism has fallen, he's reflecting on the fall of communism, at least in Russia, in the 20th century. He asks, well, does that mean capitalism, right? That we should all be pushing our chips onto the roulette table where it says capitalism? And he says, well, no. So the answer is complex. If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative. I mean, if you're producing goods, these goods are being fairly exchanged, and that excess, right, is being shared with those who may not have the means or who may not be in possession of what is needed to survive, then yeah, capitalism is a good thing. But he says, by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong judicial framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious. And the reply is certainly negative. In other words, if it sort of lacks that noble spirit of goodness, charity, and mercy, John Paul II says, beware. Centenimus Annus, this is John Paul again, I believe, says, the church acknowledges the legitimate role of profit, but he says it is possible for the financial accounts to be in order and yet the people to be humiliated and their dignity offended. And just to sort of look at this last passage here, which is taken also from Centesimus Annus, which in Latin means the 100th year. This is 100 years after Leo the 13th published Rerum Novarum. This is also wonderful. He says the church. I like this. He says the church has no models to present. So if you go up to Father so and so, or you go up to Pope Francis and you're like, solve our economic problems. Like, what is the economic model that you suggest? He's going to say, well, that's not our job. It's not our job. It's similarly if we were to go up to a priest or cardinal or pope and say, teach me about the Big Bang Theory or about astronomy, and teach me how the heavens go. And they're going to say, we're not exactly scientists. I mean, some are, obviously, but we're not exactly scientists. That isn't the role of the church, per se. There are sciences out there whose job is to answer these questions. And when we have questions about the economy, about the just distribution of goods, then we should turn to the experts in those fields. And that's what he means. He says, the church has no models to present. Models that are real and truly effective can only arise within the framework of different historical situations, through the efforts of all those who responsibly confront concrete problems in all their social, economic, political, and cultural aspects. He says, for such a task, the church offers social teaching as an indispensable and ideal orientation, a teaching which recognizes the positive value of the market enterprise, but which at the same time points out that these need to be oriented toward the common good. And so the church provides us with moral guidance. And it can identify errors in these other sciences. This is a very Thomistic idea. You have two domains. You have the domain of faith and you have the domain of reason. The question then becomes, well, how much can reason teach us based on what we know from the faith, based on what we know by faith? And so our faith teaches us certain truths about justice, certain truths about equality, certain truths about rights that we possess by nature. And so the systems that are developed need to align with those truths. But of course, that doesn't mean that there's one and only one system. And as he points out, as John Paul II points out, how we address these problems, there are historical factors, there are contingencies, it's situational. One size doesn't fit all. And so the challenges that we face now, today, may require novel solutions. And so this is where we've got to go back to this concept of work. Our work is never done. That we always have to labor. We always have to ask questions. And we also have to come into, friendly conflict with each other. Right? And talk through these things. And to put all of our ideas on the table. And then to sort out the good from the bad. So I think that about does it for the handouts. I'm not sure if anybody has any comments or questions or reactions or
I was just gonna say it's interesting to listen to like what the Christian answer is to the morally correct system, because it's easy, for me, for example, it's easy to get wrapped up in obviously the
right.
Christian view would be capitalist because if you read Marx or
it's
Engels,
not that simple. Yeah.
Right, if you read Marx or Engels, they condemn theology and they condemn the church. But yeah, it's just kind of refreshing to understand what the outlook is morally, from our side, rather than just we're the opposite of what the Marxists believe. So.
Well, unfortunately, we live in the world of 150 characters, where all of our exchanges are very simple and cliche. They don't. Twitter and Facebook, they don't really allow us to articulate complex solutions to complex problems. And so I think that, what I love about the Newman Center and universities, hopefully universities don't change, but what I appreciate is that these continue to be places, maybe one of the few places left where stuff like this can happen, or you guys can go and play ping pong, or watch the debates, or just have a kind of camaraderie where it's okay to have conversations to discuss these sorts of things, and hopefully it doesn't just reduce to name calling, but subtlety. It's so easy to oversimplify and to try to find a single factor solution to all of our problems. Why COVID? Why are people dying from COVID? Well, nobody's wearing masks. Well, okay, it's not that simple. That may be part of the problem, but let's look at it more broadly and ask hard questions about and what I think it really does. What's your name? Troy. What I think it really does is you're from my class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I never see you without your mask. It's no problem.
Yeah. I figured
That's right, Troy. Yeah. Sorry, that's a little embarrassing. This is why I hate masks, because I never see my students. Okay, Troy. Yeah, this. So this is. I just briefly lost my train of thought, but it's where we're at nowadays is just so frustrating because it is so dumb and oversimplified, and again I don't blame sort of people who just talk out of their rear ends on some of these issues on Twitter or Facebook, but academics. When I see members of the media, when I see academics engage in the same kind of fruitless tit for tat argumentation, it's really frustrating to me. And what I try to do in my class, as you know, and what I try to do in places like this is that I want to invite people to think about issues that they may have thought about before, but may not have really challenged themselves about. So, yeah, I mean, we're having a debate about this today, capitalism, socialism, but COVID, and it's just like, man, we've really got to get our heads screwed on right and understand that these are not easy problems to solve, and that they take a long time. And I think, you know, as a Catholic, like, that's the one thing that I've really come to appreciate, is that things take a long time. Like the church and how it works out problems or solutions to problems. Like, people are like, okay, I gotta go. Like, can you just give me the answer? We just want the answer. And no, we've got to like create a council, and that may take years to resolve. So we'll get, you know, we'll publish our findings maybe in about 10 years. And like, I don't have that long. I need to know today. Human beings, we're fallible. We're limited in the scope of our knowledge, and so we just have to know. We have to recognize those limitations, and we have to also realize that no one person can solve these problems by himself.
Well, and like you said before, like 90% of the time, the question is rooted a lot deeper than we think it is.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up again. And again, that's like, if there's one thing, and you know from my class, what I said today was, it's all metaphysics, man. It's all metaphysics. And like, students are like, metaphysics? What's that? Like, I go into Barnes & Noble, and in the metaphysics aisle, it's all like tarot cards and witchcraft and ridiculous stuff like that. No, I'm talking about like the hardcore study of reality and being, like, not just at a physical level, but at a much deeper level. And so, you know, when we talk about human nature, like, we're trying to develop a Catholic anthropology. We're trying to work out based on what we are told in Scripture, but also based on the best available science. Who are we, and why are we here, and what should we be doing, and is it all just random, and should we just gratify our appetites, or should we be doing something else with that? And so that's what, you know, when you're young, you may not think about it, but as you get older, these become really pressing questions, especially when you start a family. And now it's like, well, there are other people out there that need me, and I have to start thinking about them in addition to myself. And yeah, these are tough problems. But again, I think as Catholics, you know, you're in a good position because you have at your disposal a lot of this. Like, you don't have to work up all the answers yourself. Like, they're here. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of it's here. But that doesn't mean that all of it's here. And because, again, if we're all here, then all you'd have to do is go to page 363 and there's the answer. But yeah, life throws us curveballs sometimes. So, thanks, Troy. Was there anything else?
It's not really a question. It's more so of a statement. While I was listening, I really liked that in the text, and also with the way that you presented it, how I could understand how functionalists and conflict theory both tie into basically the entire concept that we were just talking about. And I literally just wrote an essay like 2 days ago about functionalist theory in the United States, and
Can you explain a little bit what that means?
So I was talking about how, for me, what I was talking about was, we were talking about inequality of wealth in the United States, and I was talking about how functionalists would see...
Are you an RSU student?
I am.
Okay.
I was talking about how functionalists would basically see the top 20% or so. If they were gone, somebody else would have to step up in their place, because that is a role that's
Correct.
necessary for society to function.
Correct.
It's exactly like you were talking
Correct.
about with the carpet thing,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So I was just like, man, I was literally just talking about that, and I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear somebody else say it.
Yeah, and again, I think this is the hard, you know, the hard truth, right? Like, this is what was it, Leo? He says, you know, nothing is more useful than to look upon the world as it is. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. Again, it doesn't mean that if your crops are dying, right, or your cows aren't giving milk, that you should just go, well, that's just the way it is. I mean, we just have to rot, you know. No, I mean, you have to like try to fix things that are broken, but you have to fix it within the system, right? I mean, there are certain indisputable, unchangeable facts, like the law of gravity. Like, there's nothing that's what goes up must come down. Like no matter how hard I flap my arms, I'm not going to levitate. It's just jump out of a window, I'll plummet. But there are things, but I can create an airplane, or I can create a glider, and so it's like working within the system that God set up for us. This is the way I think to look at it. That there are natural laws. There are laws that pertain to the good life, and so that doesn't mean that you and I have to live the same life, but it does mean that we still have to play within by the same rules. Yeah. And hierarchies are vital. Catholics recognize this because, of course, within the church, we have hierarchies. I mean, there is a hierarchy, and so hierarchies are fundamentally not a bad thing. Throughout Scripture, you see hierarchies. You see not just political hierarchies, but you see, again, within Jesus' own circle. We know that Peter was we're told that he was the favorite, and so there's even kind of like a pecking order. But is that a bad thing? And should the other apostles have been jealous? Well, we all have a role to play. And I always tell my students that, when you read about the patriarchs the founding fathers, you might say, of the universe, in Genesis, when God goes to Noah and says, look, I want you to build an ark. And Noah's like, sure, why do you want me to build an ark? I'm paraphrasing, of course. He says, well, I'm going to flood the earth, and I want to save a few of, you and your family and the animals. And Noah's like, no problem. Starts the hammer. Now, if God came to me and said, listen, I want you to build an ark because I'm going to wipe everybody out, my first response would be like, whoa, wait a second. Like, I'm not sure that I want to, be an accomplice in this, Or at least that would be my initial reaction. So Noah was the right man for the job. But when God wanted to build a nation, he chose Abraham. And we know that time and again, Abraham will, from time to time, Abraham will be like, okay, yes, sir, I'll do this. But then the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a great example of where Abraham's like, yeah, I'm not down with this because it seems like if there are righteous people there, you're going to be wiping them out too. So what if there are 50? What if there are 40? What if there are 30? And so God always finds the right man for the right job, whether it's Noah, Abraham, Moses. And so we all have jobs to play too, in a sense, right? And it's not always going to be the glamorous, right, president, actor, professor. Sometimes it's being a mom or being a dad or just being a friend, right? So I think we've got to sort of understand it. We can obviously wear multiple hats, work in multiple jobs, but it's just we have to sort of seek out. It's like the story of the talents and how we have to recognize what our talents are, and we have to utilize those talents as best we can, because those talents can't always be put to the same use, and they're not always going to work. I mean, if you're a great baseball player, that doesn't mean it's going to translate into basketball. So you've got to constantly be looking within yourself, reflecting, and saying, what am I meant to do? What am I good at? How can I put these skills or these talents to use? And again, that creates, in a way, a hierarchy. Not everybody can be the leader. Not everybody can be a prince. What is the old Incredibles line about being super or being incredible?
No, if everyone has powers, then no one does.
Then no one does, right. And so, if you're playing King of the Castle and everybody wants to be the princess or everybody wants to be the prince, then, what's so special about being a prince then? So, again, there's a lot more that we can talk about, but does anybody else want to offer up a thought or a comment to refute me or to refute Leo? Yeah, did you have something? No? Well, shall we then call it a day? Well, I appreciate all of you coming again. It's very nice. And hopefully, we'll see each other again sometime. Or, again, if you ever have questions or if you ever want to chat about these things. Gerald is somebody who I think is very wise in his years, and he has interest in these things. But you could always just send me an email or chat me up. I'll try to. And again, these are great books. You can never go wrong with Leo. So I appreciate all you coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.